correct? Now the second is coordination. What is coordination? Well, it is the purposive use of communication resources to organize, stimulate, or control the performance of individuals, groups, or organizations. Okay. We have added the category of dialogue over here as well. Okay. Most, if not all, current communication planning efforts can be categorized as involving one or more of the goal categories in the matrix and one or more of the three broad types of communication resources. Now, any system of categories is open to question. No special claims are made for this one other than for its pragmatic use in describing the wide range of current communication planning efforts. The types of communication planning identified and discussed differ from each other principally in the nature of the goals which are addressed and the types of communication resources involved. Now, a second criteria of difference is the degree to which the planners of a given type are engaged in creating, allocating, or using communication resources, or in some combination of the three. Okay, the discussion of each type of planning will also cover the impact of social image on planning as well as the effect of different system perspective. Okay, so let's begin with the first type of planning, that is a telecommunication planning. Okay, now telecommunication planners deal almost exclusively with point-to-point communication resources, including those systems that are used by the mass media, such as satellite and microwave transmission systems. Their orientation is primarily towards the creation and maintenance of communication resources for others to use. Correct? When successful, planners provide resources to satisfy the needs of an important segment of the society, ranging from individual telephone users to other large systems which rely on telecommunication resources to achieve their goals. Planners of postal systems are in much the same situation, although the nature of communication resources they plan for differs from those of telecommunication planners in obvious ways, being comprised primarily of organized human effort and transportation systems. Increasingly, however, telecommunications by such methods as electronic mail are providing an attractive alternative to traditional postal technologies. So this is leading in cases where two systems are quite separately controlled and planned to inter-system conflict over goals and resources. So the impact of social image on telecommunication planning can be quite direct. As telecommunication resources are central to the flow of information in society, they are objects of great interest to governments. In some societies, telecommunication industries are closely regulated. In others, they are government owned or controlled. Okay. Moreover, in capitalist societies, telecommunication planning is done primarily in response to projected demand for services. In centrally planned, or you can rather say a control image societies, planning tends to respond to needs, as articulated by social goals. Now, because of the size and technological complexity of telecommunication systems, planning tends to be done from a relatively high level perspective, regardless of social image. Planning tends to be relatively long range too. Okay, I can give you a good example of telecommunication planning. Okay, that is Australia's Telecom 2000 report. Okay, Australian Telecommunications Commission had set this up in 1973. Okay, now this 25-year plan for the development of telecommunication services in Australia was actually initiated in 1973 in response to the challenge posed by rapid technological change in telecommunication resources. Okay, this planning effort is notable for several elements. First, it was centralized activity with broad national system perspective in a democratic society. Okay, perhaps in consequence, there was a great emphasis on open planning and the participation of a wide range of users, interest groups, and so on. The strengthening of open planning, along with a call for continued assessment of the changing social and economic environment, were major recommendations of the plan. Secondly, the impact of social image is seen in explicit attention to the development of a planning approach for Telecom 2000. Two contrasting approaches to futures planning were noted. The first is deterministic, holding that the future is determined by the past. Hence, projections would be primarily planning method. Correct? The second is the view that the future cannot be predicted, but rather created. Okay, so this normative view would require building alternative images of desired futures as goals against which projections can be measured and actions to create the desired future planned. So, a planning method fitting well with this approach is scenario development. In fact, the planners of Telecom 2000 felt that the truth lies somewhere between these two approaches. So, their planning approach blended deterministic and normative models and projections and scenarios. Another interesting example may be found in telecommunications planning in Mexico. Mexico has a strongly centralized federal system of government. Telecommunication planning and regulation are centralized, and corporations being granted concessions for the creation or use of communication resources under direct government control. So, the first national planning effort in telecommunications came in response to the 1968 Olympic Games, which were held in Mexico City. Okay, so telecommunication system typical of most developing countries were replaced by a modern system using the advanced technology then available. Okay, now it's been more than 10 years later. Okay, so technological changes in telecommunication systems pose a new challenge and are establishing goals for yet another planning and development effort. So, both in 1968 and now, the system must adapt to a changing environment through the creation of a new telecommunication resources. So, telecommunication planners tend to have engineering and other technical backgrounds and skills. Some are economists, and there seems to be increasing participation of other social scientists in planning telecommunication systems. So, the criteria that guides telecommunication planners are complex. Okay, so there is an overriding concern for the cost and efficiency, particularly in commercial telecommunication systems where profit is the goal. Further, as the examples show, service criteria are also important, and telecommunication planners are increasingly concerned with the social impact of their systems. Okay, so let's move on to the next planning. Okay, let's see how mass media planning works. Okay, now the orientation of mass media planners is primarily towards the allocation and utilization of communication systems resources. There is a secondary orientation towards the creation of systems resources, but this is done in the context of expanded or improved resources which these planners utilize. So, depending on the nature of the social image, planning of mass media ranges from highly centralized to highly decentralized. Right? In some societies, the major mass media, which is the press, the radio, the television, film, etc., are government controlled and planned in a relatively centralized way from a broad, often national perspective. Okay, whereas in other societies, the media are privately held and planning proceeds in relative independence, guided by broad policies, regulations, and in capitalist economies, the nature of the market for services. So, the perspective of planning can be towards comparatively small systems such as small town newspaper or a community radio station privately owned and operated for profit.